This is the Birds on Powerlines podcast, and in this episode, we're continuing our discussion of Season 1 of the Netflix series, The Sandman. In our first Sandman podcast, we took a deep dive into the first 3 episodes, so please look for that podcast as well. Here we are continuing with episodes 4, 5, and 6, Ahopeinhell, 24/7, and The Sound of Her Wings. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Okay, so episode 4, Ahopeinhell. I think this one might not be my favorite episode, but it might be my favorite episode. I'm not entirely sure yet. It's been a little while since I rewatched the entire series, but for right now, out of like the first 4 episodes, I do really quite enjoy this one. Mostly because of like just the cinematics of this entire episode. Especially during the fight scene with Dream and Lucifer. But actually, I just really, all of the angles throughout this episode, like they're so like odd. There's such weird angles, but like because they're like from like above or like from a really weird angle below. But I just really like all of the angles in this episode. But right out the gate, it kind of surprised me that the gates of hell seem like very dinky. I mean, they just seem really thin and not like, especially compared to the gates of the dreaming. They don't seem impressive at all. They don't even really seem that scary. They're just like in a cave. The cave is made up of a bunch of people, but it's just like a little like garden gate in a cave. So it just was interesting that it just appeared so dinky, especially compared to the impressive, it's like establishing shot that we get of the dreaming and at the end of episode 1. But I actually think it's interesting that Morpheus can appear different to different people, and like we see this a little later on, yes, in the comics, but also like in the show. There's the bonus episode where like he literally looks like a cat, and we've seen, like we can see in the comics, since I read the comics even though you didn't, he does repeatedly look different to different people. I mean, yes, he does have the standard appearance that we the viewer see him as, but it really is an interesting touch that they the showrunners, yes, the creators, the writers, decided to completely recast him just for a little short amount of time, just so he would look different to Nada, and like the viewer would see that he looks different to her. And it's really interesting because, like, you know, like dreams are so personal to each and every person that it's no wonder that Morpheus looks different to everyone depending on what they think of their dreams or like dreams in general. And I have to go back and look. I'm just really going through, like I wrote down every observation I made as the episode progressed. But I have to actually look at where John, going back to the real world, where John was located in the comics after he got out of the institution. Because I don't remember that if it was actually, like in the show it's Buffalo, but I don't remember if it was actually established where he was or not. And also an interesting change that the showrunners made is that Rosemary died in the comics. She died as soon as, like, John killed her when she brought him to his ruby. She died. And I was actually thinking up until this point that she did in the show as well, but no, actually she stayed alive, and that was an interesting touch. It kind of makes John appear a little bit more sympathetic. I mean, even though we do see what goes down a few episodes later, but he does, and in this moment to the viewer, appear a little bit more sympathetic, and I'm thinking that's a really interesting choice. But yeah, going back to, like, I guess cinematic choices, I mentioned before, I really love the battle scene between Morpheus and Lucifer. That was a very, very good scene. I noticed, like, when Morpheus said, "I am a universe," we zoomed into his eyes, and his eyes were like the stars in the comics, and it's so interesting. and like going off of that, actually Matthew, like we see a little bit more of him, and he's my favorite character. he really is just my favorite character. But it really impresses me that he's able, like, I mean, yeah, I guess waking up after you died and being a raven and going around with the anthropomorphized being of the concept of dreams is a little bit weird, but he really manages to he's like, okay, sure, let's go to hell. And like everything he sees here, he really manages to just take it in stride. Like, it's really making me wonder, who was Matthew? How is he able to just take all of this and be completely, well, more or less completely unfazed, but at the same time, he is like so loyal to Dream, even though like they have barely known each other, and Dream definitely does not treat him well because he doesn't want to get attached to his raven like he did to Jessamy. But like, despite that, Matthew is able to like really empathize and remain loyal to him, even though he basically barely knows him. He refuses to leave him, even though Morpheus like insists, you have to leave me, but he does not. He remains by his side, and he even like right at the end, he gives Morpheus that little bit of hope that he needs to say, I am hope. And that's just like, it's crazy. Like, I just, who was he? And I'm not sure. I haven't finished the comics, but I really do wonder, who was Matthew originally, and how is he able to just like do all of this? But yeah, like, and also like Matthew, like talking about him a little bit more just because he's great. I love Matthew. He was walking the entire time, as like crows and ravens do, but like it gave me the feeling he was walking because he's still used to being a human, except when the two of them actually first enter the Palace of Hell, and there's the Palace of Hell, and there's like weird creepy blood dripping out of the door. That kind of freaked him out a little bit. So he does fly at that point, but other than that, we don't really see, we see that Matthew kind of does prefer to walk more. But yeah, and really the last thing that I kind of want to leave off my part with is that exchange between Lucifer and Morpheus at the end, after Morpheus won the battle between them. Why should we let you leave? What power do dreams have in hell? Lucifer asks, and Morpheus says, along the lines of, what power would hell have if those imprisoned there were not able to dream of heaven? And that really stuck with me. That whole exchange right at the end, that really is something I wanted to note. Like, just really that was profound. That was a very interesting little piece of dialogue right there. The dialogue and really the actions of the characters, how we're able to see, like, right now, Matthew, I'm talking about mostly right now, get fleshed out a bit more. And also just the cinematics. Like, I mean, I've consistently, every episode in the show, I've been really impressed with the, like, camera angles, the lighting, all that stuff. I mean, I'm not like a huge like film buff, but that's something I definitely noticed because it just is so odd, but they do really work. Like, I mean, you would never think to have like basically a camera like looking up at someone, but like from the side, and like you get kind of the side profile, like right when Morpheus is at the gates of hell. But it just is really interesting. And yeah, there are a lot of interesting things about this episode, but like those things were probably the things I liked the most, definitely.
My feelings of ahopeinhell. I think it was pretty funny because when I was listening to your comments, I realized that I had written down some of the exact things that you thought. So we were completely on the same wavelength with a lot of the thoughts. The other thing that I had to do with this episode was sort of go back. I looked at some images of this episode online just to remind myself of everything that happened, because there's quite a bit. And that big dichotomy between Rosemary and John and what's going on in hell with Dream and Matthew and Lucifer, Morningstar, and the demons there. And while I did that, I realized that the reason this was so different was because this is actually two separate parts of the comic books. So two comic books sort of mashed up together, which I found interesting that they chose to do that. But that comes back to your comments on the cinematography. What I loved in terms of the cinematography here is that as Matthew and Dream were going deeper and deeper into hell, things were getting worse and worse between Rosemary and John. So I thought that parallel was so well done. I really love that. I felt that it sort of built the tension in a way that if they were separated, that it wouldn't have, I guess maybe it wouldn't have done the same for me. So I thought that was really cool. And the ideas that were brought forward in the way hell looked and everything, I thought that was really well done. And apparently a lot of the ideas are right out of the comic book. So I thought that was interesting. So let me get into some of these thoughts. I thinking about how much I like this episode, I really, like I said, love that cinematography and everything going on in hell and how cool that was. But the thing that really, it doesn't take away from the fact that I love this episode, but in terms of, thinking, oh, is this my favorite episode or not? I'm so unsettled between what was going on between John and Rosemary that it really upset me. So it's just like trying to decide, well, I love this episode, but that was just terrible. So there's that sort of mixed feeling about that, and thinking about like, why did she not leave? And after he goes and gets the ruby, she could have left. And apparently the ending for Rosemary is very different in the comic book, which, that probably would have destroyed me. But I think it's interesting that she has the amulet, and I'm really curious as to what she does with it. If you think about how things went for John's mother, that kind of corrupted her in a way, I guess. I don't know, but I'd like to think that Rosemary's actually going to get rid of it. I don't know, but it comes back to this idea that no good deed goes unpunished, and in this way, John's kind of protecting her, which is sort of interesting. It's just really, really interesting, that whole dynamic. And then going back to what's going on in hell and following Dream and Matthew to the palace, and then him being led past his ex-love, Nada. And that, again, really shows how cruel that Dream can be. Like, I know this is probably something in the comic books. And while I was looking at images and stuff to remind me about different parts of this episode, I did see some references to that book from the comics. So it's just interesting to see what's going on there. But wow, that's pretty evil of Dream to do that to her. That she defied him, and then that deserves eternal punishment. Like I just feel so bad for her. But I love the way that Dream looks different to different people. And I just think that's super cool. And so she automatically sees him as someone different. That's that I loved. And then your comment about Matthew being, one of your favorite characters. Yes, Matthew is cool. He's the best, right? And he does his job to help his master, just by sort of strengthening Dream to in his fight with Lucifer, in a way that was kind of a weird interaction. I don't know if I love the line, that dreams don't die, right? The way, anyways, I'm not sure if I was a fan of that. But I understand what his role is there. So I think that was super cool. And no matter what, he doesn't leave. So there was that thought. And then that Matthew is going to stick with Dream no matter what Dream tries to tell him to do. So, but then he also provides that little bit of levity. So he, in terms of, when he was going to fly to check things out when they got sidetracked, and then he ends up being in that forest. And I think that goes to something. I read that that's something like the Wood of Suicides, or those trees are actually people who had died by suicide. So he was kind of freaked out about that, but he kind of makes light about it. But yeah, but yeah, and that comes back to him walking, right? So he's walking through hell. I guess because he was really creeped out by that. But yeah, so that was a thing. And in terms of the battle between Dream and Lucifer, yeah, super cool. I just love that. I love the fact that they actually get the wounds from the challenge. But yeah, and I actually wrote down that quote that gave you pause, right, where you're talking about that, where Dream challenges Lucifer in a way when he defeats her or defeats him. That, where would hell be if the inhabitants couldn't dream of heaven? And yeah, so I agree that was quite something. And I really love that thought, because that is sort of contingent on that. And in a way, it kind of makes it that that Dream is actually in a way more powerful. I know he says that Lucifer Morningstar is next in power to the creator, but he definitely has something on them, right? And then in terms of that, Lucifer saying that they're going to kill Dream or eventually get to him. But it comes back down to that. I mean, even if they did, then what is going to be left for hell? So I don't think that Lucifer can do that to Dream, even though they might want to threaten Dream with that. Right. So, yeah, something to think about. I don't know how that goes down in the comics, because I have not read them, and I'm not up on that, but it's just something to think about. So yeah, that was a lot of what I was thinking. I'm just kind of looking at my thoughts here on my paper, just trying to make sure I've got everything. Yeah, your comment about the gates. Yeah, I guess I see where you're going with that, because they look kind of like a garden gate, but I mean, they're right in that wall that's built of, like, I guess people. So I don't know. I think that fact alone is pretty imposing. So I I don't know. Maybe the gates don't really matter, and you can't really open them without having one of the people in the wall sort of give you the permission to do that, or summon the demon to open the gate. So I don't know. But in contrast, though, going in the gates for the palace, that was pretty impressive. Like I said, in contrast. So I don't know. I still love that whole appearance in the path going to the palace and all of that. So that was really, really interesting. I just loved the way all of that looked. But yeah, so I guess those are the highlights of what I was thinking in this episode. And having this be our second time through, I know that the story with John is going to keep going, obviously, because Dream has to get that ruby back, and how all that goes down. But coming to the realization between what happened with Rosemary in the comics, like I do prefer this ending for her. But I really would love to know what she does with that amulet. I like to believe that she is a genuinely good person, and yeah, but you don't know. And I guess it doesn't appear in the comics either, because that didn't happen in the comics. So I'm not sure, but anyways, it just gives me something to think about. And, I really enjoy this episode. On the second viewing, a lot more came to me, and I think there's probably a lot more depth there. The symbolism of everything going on in hell, I'm just not up on all of that stuff, so I'm unaware of it. But like I said, when I was looking at images and stuff, I saw like the random comments people were making on the internet about different aspects of it. So there's a lot going on there. So it's almost worth going back and looking at all those images and studying and finding out where they're all coming from. So this was a really good episode, and I'm glad we're going back and looking at all these episodes, and I'm hoping in season 2 that some of these ideas are going to come back, and especially that whole thing with Nada. Or Nada, or however you say her name. But so this is a really good episode, and there's so much to talk about there. It's so rich. But let's get on with the next episode.
That's actually a really good point. I never even really picked up on all of the building of tension between those two separate scenarios with Rosemary and John, and with Dream and Matthew and Hell. Because in the comics they're not they're in two completely separate chapters. They're not. I mean, they probably were taking place at the same time. They must have been taking place at the same time, but that actually didn't. They weren't together. They weren't presented together. They're presented in two separate issues. So it's interesting that the show writers and the showrunners and the writers decided to put those two things together to kind of play off each other. But actually, and you mentioned also Dream and Nada. Actually, in the comics, we learn a bit more about the nature of their relationship in a series that takes place after this. It's called Season of the Mists, and we kind of learn more about what led to that happening, and we see what happens afterwards. But basically, due to the events of this season and the entire first few collections of the Sandman, Dream actually he really grows as a person. We see him learning to forgive people and really to understand humans more. I mean, he's been alive for this whole time and he still doesn't really understand people. But after this season, he really understands humanity a lot more, so he actually does free Nada. He forgives her, and he tells her that she's welcome in the dreaming anytime she wants. She can go freely anywhere, and she forgives him a bit as well. They both kind of understand where the other was coming from. I mean, she still is kind of, of course, understandably upset that he left her there for 10,000 years, but it is interesting to see that this is not the end. We do see Nada again, and hopefully in season 2 we probably will see the conclusion of that if we're following the comics. But yeah, moving on to episode 5, 24/7. I never liked this episode. I don't like it. I still don't like it. I've never liked watching it closely. Even the first 2 times I rewatched this, I didn't like this episode. The second time, I don't even remember. I might have actually just skipped over it because I did not like this episode. And actually, in the comics, the way it's presented is actually a lot more dark and twisted, if that's even possible. But yeah, there were some things in the comics and the way they presented it that didn't really translate that well to screen, and that's probably, I'm anticipating you're probably going to have a few questions about that. But actually, in the comics, the reason that we're seeing, in the show, these, the TV is, going the entire time John's watching it, and we hear, all these news reports of people going crazy. But in the comics, we see, little panels of what's playing on the TV, and we just watch it, progressively devolve and go completely crazy. But it's not really clear if that is happening outside or if John is making that happen to the TV. It's not really entirely clear about that. Probably it is actually in the comics. It still is actually, all this stuff is happening outside, but it never is really touched on that much, to my knowledge, to what I remember. But yeah, in the comics, it's very, very dark. And for example, it's presented almost entirely from the perspective. It kind of switches a bit between John and Betty, or John and Bet. She kind of starts it off, and then it goes to John when she dies. But she's a lot less sympathetic in the comics. In the show, we're kind of seeing it from third person perspective. We are following her, but we do we are kind of able to see her as more just like someone who's just lost. But in the comics, she really just, all she sees in all the customers, all the people she has in the diner is they're just writing material. That's all they are to her. And she literally point blank says that. And like she's very, very, very judgmental of everyone in there, and just like thinks about like the best ways to like write them, and she still wants to give them happy endings and all that stuff. But it's also in the comics it's shown more that the ruby it really, like, John, instead of like really just messing with their minds and stuff, he gives them dreams, and he makes them hallucinate and all these things until like they can't really tell the difference between reality and dreams anymore. So that like really that to me makes a little bit more sense than the way it was portrayed in the show. Like in the show, we're kind of like messing with time, we're messing with people's heads, we're messing with the outside world, we're messing with the things people do, we're making sure they don't go outside, all this stuff. We're making them do all kinds of crazy things. But in the comics, like it places a much heavier influence on like the borderline between like what is real and what is not real, what's in your head, what you're dreaming. Or hallucinating, and it really kind of ties a bit more into what like dream can actually do. So that is one thing that was a little bit different, and I feel like that's probably just one thing that kind of got a little bit lost in translation. But they like he kind of like does like it goes like hour by hour, which is why it's called 24/7. And in the comics it goes hour by hour, and like he does different things, and he doesn't have so much of an influence on telling, like, the world would be better if everyone told the truth, said what they actually wanted to say. But yeah, it kind of is just like a whole like messing with the borderline between dreams and reality, and that's why I feel like you're probably gonna say that like it just didn't really make that much sense with the ruby and what Dream was doing in the show. But in the comics it does make a little bit more sense. It's probably just something that didn't translate quite as well. But anyway, and at the end I wanted to touch on the fact that like both Dream and John have two different ways of like kind of seeing the world and seeing the nature of people, because John sees like only the bad. He sees like things that unfulfilled desires, unfulfilled things that people would have wanted to do, but they just like can't because they think they have to present a certain way, they have to say things that they don't actually mean or do things that they don't want to because like of the because they imagine that people are expecting this from them. But whereas Dream sees like the good potential of people don't do things because they just haven't done it yet, but they're dreaming of doing, like Bet wants to be a writer, and that's a good thing. Or like, and all these other things. And like I remember one of the characters wanted to like run away to where no one would ever find her and all this stuff. And it's just really interesting that they're both looking at the same people, and they're both I think they're both seeing the same things, but John chooses to take this as one way because he feels that like all his life his mother's lied to him, he's been like abandoned by everyone and all these things, and he chooses to see all of these like unfulfilled dreams as bad things, whereas Dream sees all of these unfulfilled dreams as things that people just haven't done yet, but things that they're hoping that they want, that would make their lives better because they're holding on to this little secret like desire to do something with their lives that they're not able to do at the present time, and it gives them like hope for the future. It's kind of tying back to last episode where Dream's like, I am hope. And all of these things, it's just really two different ways of seeing the same thing, and it's very, very interesting that like it's just an interesting comment on, I guess, human nature, how two people can look at the same thing and see totally different things in a person.
I know 24/7 isn't your favorite episode. I totally get that. And for me, I think this is the first time, I mean, I know I've looked at the series before, but I think this is the first time I actually really watched the entire episode from beginning to end. So I saw little snippets of it, kind of thing, and I think that probably was on the airplane. I think I was reading while you were watching it, and then I was looking up at it, so I didn't actually hear everything that was being said, and I didn't see all the scenes. I saw the end, and then I saw the beginning, I think, and then little bits and pieces in the middle. So so I know why this is not your favorite. I mean, it's because, it's straight up horror, right? I think this really definitely puts the horror into the description of the show. So, but as for that, I mean, I'm not an expert on horror, but from my limited expertise in the genre, I really think it was well done. It was damn disturbing, and that's what it's supposed to be. I mean, you can feel it, the tension building, very, very, right on, like you can just, it's palpable. And you expect the eventual demise of everyone, right? That's what happens in horror, right? There might be one person left, at the end of the day. This one went full throttle and just, and you know it's coming. It's just a matter of when and how. So, and that's horror, right? I know that sounds bad, but typically that's how it goes. So you go, and I mean, at the end, you're even thinking, John could be the end of this too. I mean, that isn't how this one ended. I mean, John was the last one left, but usually, I guess in a lot of, I guess the cliche is that, your hero is the last one left sort of thing, but that's not how it ends here. But it goes back, and I was thinking about this because I don't agree with this statement in that, if you go far enough, all stories end in death. I don't believe, I mean, eventually people die, right? But I mean, there's death and then there's death, right? But I think that goes back to horror, right? Because usually horror films, there's a lot of death in them, and this is your stereotypical kind of horror episode. So I think that's, that is correct, right? But considering I thought this was actually well done, I actually looked up the director, and the director's name is Jamie Childs. And I looked up his filmography, and there actually isn't much on IMDb. I actually had to do some digging. Like for IMDb, it really just has The Sandman, something called Willow, which I'm not familiar with, but apparently it's quite popular. And another thing that I've heard of, but I haven't seen, but I'm pretty sure you're familiar with this, and that's His Dark Materials. So I thought that was really interesting. So I actually went down that rabbit hole a little bit, and I looked up His Dark Materials, and Daphne Keane is on there, and we, of course, we know of her, and most recently from The Acolyte. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So then I started to, kind of look, he's relatively young, but really I think apparently he's really kind of started in 2008. And guess with what? Doctor Who. And that was in the 13th Doctor's time, so Jodie Whittaker. So that sort of gives you a perspective of how sort of fresh he is. So it's interesting, right? And then as for your detailed analysis of the comic book, I really appreciate that, and I was really hoping that we were going to get more on Nana, and I'm really glad that the comic books do more, and I agree that if they put more of did I say Nana is Nada, of course, Nada in series in the second season. I think that really would definitely show his growth, right? I really agree with that, right? So I I hope they do that. Because I just felt so bad for her being left there for 10,000 years, and it just seems so cruel. Like because I mean, you're starting to empathize with Dream, and then here he does something so, even Matthew is like, really, so, and that's the other thing in this episode, 24/7, you don't get any of Matthew's levity. So that really doesn't offset the darkness of what's going on. But yeah, you were right. I had some problems with this plot. I was just not, I just couldn't agree with it. And I had problems with it. I couldn't imagine just not being able to lie would make people go psychotic. I was really having a problem with that. And it just like, so I was just thinking, oh, well, it's just horror and I'll just accept that. But it was really causing me issues. So, listening to what you're saying, like, I can't imagine it being even more dark and twisted, like you're saying in the comics, but I think it's interesting that Bet is different. But it makes more sense knowing this now, because I couldn't understand what she was burning. And like I was thinking, well, she must be burning her story, but that would make sense why it was in the diner, because then I could imagine her writing in the diner and using all of the regulars as people in her plots. And I mean, even though she might be more judgmental in the comics, it's good to know that she still wants to give everyone a happy ending. So that made more sense. And I do agree, like knowing about the comics, and the fact that John was actually sort of almost setting them up, right? I mean, if he was causing them to hallucinate or dream and see all kinds of weird, I don't know what, he would have been doing, but that would make way more sense to me as to why, everyone in the diner could descend to the point of being completely irrational. Right. I could see in some cases in the world where, if you couldn't lie to someone, people might get angry, and maybe there'd be some people that could get pretty violent about that. But I can't see just the fact of not being able to lie would make everyone go so nuts, like, because this is the point of being completely psychotic. So, I mean, that becomes completely irrational. Right. So, the fact that in the comics, he was manipulating them by causing them to hallucinate or whatever, that would make absolute much more sense. And that would have added a lot. I don't know why they didn't bring that out, but even adding that would also explain why John wants to rule the dreaming. Like, I was like, where did that come from? Like, it didn't make sense to me. Like, all of a sudden he goes from not wanting anyone to lie to wanting to rule the dreaming. Like, that's where I really had a non sequitur with that. So, so thank you for explaining all that. And now it makes much more sense. So I would imagine that other people who hadn't read the comics might have felt just as sort of confused or had to suspend their disbelief, as I was doing. I was just like, okay, let's just go with this. But it actually having the understanding of the comics makes that a lot richer. So yeah, that was a lot of help. And then in terms of 24/7, I just thought it was a 24-hour diner. That's where they came from. So it's interesting to know in the comics that they actually did it by like hour by hour. So yeah, if I ever get time, I probably should look that up. So I think that's interesting. And then about your two perspectives, I totally agree. Right. So they both see humans in different ways, and ironically, Dream is the more positive, right? And I mean, I can understand the history of John and why, he resents people lying, because he feels that he's been, I guess, slighted because his mother was lying to him all this time, and yeah, I get it. But then I was thinking a little bit more about desire at the end, and I think we were even saying, like, desire really has it in for Dream, right? And I started to think, like, why might that be? And then, thinking about this episode, it kind of came to me as to, I don't know, what the writers were thinking but I mean, if you think about it, I mean, dreams and desires, right? You dream about things that you desire. And that would sort of, because I see desire as being kind of jealous of Dream in a way. I mean, I guess he's thinking, well, you dream what you desire. So, that sort of oversteps into desire's realm. But the thing is, dreaming is more than that, right? I mean, I know Dream was saying that dreams are hope as well. I mean, they also are your nightmares and your fantasies and your imagination, right? So just because you imagine things doesn't mean you desire them. So I kind of feel like maybe that's why desire is kind of feels kind of, I'm going to say jealous. Because dreaming is more than desires, right? Even though you dream what you desire. You know what I mean? So I'm sort of going with that. So I'm going to sort of keep that thought. If I have more things to add to that as we see more of desire, I might expand on that. But that just sort of came to me while we were watching these episodes and sort of reflecting on how Dream sees his role and the idea of dreaming and hoping, right? And I think you even said, you dream about what you desire, right? So there you go. But anyways, all right. So that's sort of my thoughts on 24/7. Yeah, I liked it, but again, I'm not a huge fan of horror, right? So, but I think it was well done. But yeah, I don't need to watch that again. I just seeing what people do to especially when Bet pokes out her eyes and oh my God, yeah. And cutting off your own fingers and yeah, no, that's not, I just, that kind of stuff just kind of creeps me out. I that's the point, but yeah, so I wouldn't say this was my favorite episode, even though I think it was well done. So yeah, so let's go on to the next one. And I think you said the next one is one of your favorites. So we'll get into that one.
Yeah, honestly, it's no wonder that I don't like this episode because I don't like horror. I don't like horror at all. People are like, let's watch a horror movie. I don't want to watch the horror movie. So yeah, it's no wonder that I do not like episode 5. But I do like his dark materials. I like the book series, and I also like the soundtrack of the show as well. But I didn't realize that Jamie Childs was involved in both projects actually. But thinking about it, it really does kind of make sense because both deal with some horror-esque themes, some very mature themes like morality and mortality. Though his dark materials is a little bit more coming of age because we're following the protagonist from as when she's a child to when she comes into adulthood, whereas in Sandman we're just following one guy mainly, one immortal being. But yeah, it really it does make sense that that Jamie Childs decided to or was invited to work on both projects actually. But and also it is interesting how some things just don't translate from the book to the screen. Even though the Sandman was originally comics, it's not it was actually a physical pages, just normal book. It was comics, so we did have a bit of visual aspect to base this episode off of. But I guess the fact that the character of John was changed actually quite a bit from the comics. He's made a little bit more sympathetic and a bit more sympathetic and also a bit more honestly empathetic in the show, because he spared Rosemary, for example, and he definitely was not as twisted and violent as he was in the comics, or really just and we also added a bit of reasoning to why he is this way, because he felt that his mother lied to him for such a long time and he just wanted to see people tell the truth, and he thought that everything would be better if everyone told the truth, whereas in the comics it's not really explained why he's doing all this stuff. He just wants the ruby back, and then he's just well, then I can do stuff with the ruby and become the new Dream Lord and all this stuff. But yeah, it is just interesting how some things just don't translate between the page and the screen. But it is nice that it's definitely not nice, but more of I guess a bit of a shock when we go from episode 5, 24/7, which I do not like, to episode 6, The Sound of Her Wings, which I very much like. I think it's my favorite episode. For mainly 2 reasons, and those 2 reasons are 2 characters. I really just love Death and I love Hop. I love them. they're just such great characters, and I really think that both of their actors did a very good job of portraying their comic book counterparts in a way that felt both faithful to the original comics and fresh and new. But also I just really love the relationship that Dream is shown to have with both of them. And it's just like, because so far up until this point, we've kind of just seen a whole bunch of bad things happen to Dream. Like, he's been trapped and he's been imprisoned. He's been, like, all his stuff has been taken from him. He goes on a, like, vengeful tirade. He goes on a vengeful, like, vendetta against Roderick Burgess and all his family. He goes to hell to try and get his stuff back. He goes, like, he's just, like, he's not catching a break at all. His kingdom's been destroyed. The only person there left is Lucien, and she gives him Matthew, and, like, that's, like, really the only two positive things that happened to him at all in the first, like, 5 episodes are the fact that he, like, gets his stuff back after a lot of hard work. He has a new raven, even though he doesn't really love, like, being close to Matthew. He's, like, worried that another thing like what happened to Jessamy will happen to Matthew, probably. And Lucien is still there and supporting him, but everyone else is left. But yeah, but then we have episode 6, and we see his relationship with his older sister Death, and we see his relationship with his friend Hob, and it's just really nice that something good we finally see something good happen to Dream, and then as a result he learns and grows from his experiences with these two people. I really like the character of Death because, like, she's honestly the most, like, human of any of the Endless, just because I guess she's so, like, intertwined with, like, people on a daily basis. Like, they're, like, she says that, like, all people really need, like, at the end of their life, but I also think, like, just in general, it's just a kind word and a friendly face, and that's just so really powerful. And it's just so interesting to know that, like, at one point she felt like throwing in the towel because she just was tired of the fact that people always feared when she came for them. But, like, she learned to kind of change her way of thinking about her job, and, like, and then again, the thing, well, even to add on to that, the fact that she feels now that her job, her purpose, is her function, and her function is to, like, serve humanity, and to, like, all of the Endless exist because humanity exists. That's just so interesting and so powerful because, like, arguably she is, like, as one of the older members of the Endless, I would assume that she's one of the more, like, I guess, powerful ones. But she doesn't let that, like, or at least not anymore, she doesn't let that, like, distance herself from really feeling happy. Like, even though she has all of this responsibility, and the fact that one may feel that her job is very lonely, she has learned to think about, like, her existence and her job, her life, in a way that, like, honestly, pretty much anyone could learn from. Like, she does not, like, see the things that, like, one would think are bad about her life. She learns to, like, almost rephrase everything in her mind in a, like, way that gives her joy. And it's just really, really interesting that she's just so, like, she's so compassionate, she's so down to earth, and really she's just very good with humans. I mean, Dream even says she's really good with humans. Unlike him and most other members of the Endless. I mean, we see, like, Desire basically sees people as, like, little, like, playthings and whatever. But she's just so normal, and it's just really refreshing that, like, there's just such a normal person in this, like, whole series. And it's also interesting that, like, she's the personification of death, but she's so just lively. She's the most, like, excited and, you know, joyous person, really, that we see so far. And then moving on to Hob, I really love just, like, his relationship with Dream because, going back to Death, one more thing I forgot to mention, because Death also teaches Dream, like, even though the two of them have been siblings for as long as Dream has been alive, like, he still is, now he's learning that, now he's able to learn from Death, like, now that he's, like, done with his whole quest, and he's just sad and moping and feeling down in the dumps about the fact that he doesn't have anything to do anymore. The fact that, like, Death is able to, like, just teach him, like, just teach him in general, and he's willing to learn, shows, like, a lot of character growth from him, because, like, we saw, like, definitely at the beginning of this season, he was just totally, like, you know, this, like, ball of hatred and vengeance and annoyance, and just like, I don't need anyone, blah blah blah. But now he's, like, learning that he does need people, and he is now more willing to accept the fact that, like, other people can help him, and he can ask for help from other people. I mean, she even chides him for, like, being so, like, stubborn. Like, didn't you once think that I was worried about you? No, yeah. So, and then now moving on to Hob, this is another example of how Dream, like, he really does need people. Like, I mean, Dream got mad at Hob for, like, for insinuating that, like, he's lonely and he wants a friend, which is something that's totally normal, something any normal person, any normal human would understand and would relate to. But Dream thinks, like, at that time he thought of himself as, like, almost above, like, detached from humanity, but now now in the present day he's learned and he's forgiven Hob for speaking the truth. But then again, I just really like Hob as a character, because he even though bad things happen to him, he just gets back up and he's like, what? Death is a mug's game. What? I've got so much to live for, over and over and over again. And it's just such a precious, like, relationship that the two have, because, like, I mean, imagine having someone that you can come back to and you want to meet them, like, over every 100 years, over several centuries, and they still have the same, like, just general vibe of being trying their best to live a good life. And also this, like, relationship between the two of them and how it's evolved and changed shows that Dream, first of all, can change, he can grow, and he can make mistakes. I mean, for example, when Dream just went off and pursued William Shakespeare in the middle of the Hob and Dream's conversation, that was not a very nice thing to do. That's not a good thing to do to your friend. But, and of course just, like, walking out on him when Hob calls him lonely. But it's just so interesting that, like, Hob, like, even though the two of them had that fight and then Dream missed their appointment in the next 100 years, he was willing to wait for him. Like, he held out hope that, like, that Dream would come back eventually, even though he had no idea what had happened to him. And that's just really sweet. That's just really a sweet thing to do. And then, I think I had more, but that's probably about it for now. But just, yeah, I just really like the relationship that Dream and Hob have, and that Dream and Death have, and that we're kind of seeing, like, in this episode, which is, like, just right in the middle of the season. We're just getting a little bit of a breath of positivity and fresh air and growth from Dream, and before we go into the back half of the season and then everything gets kind of crazy again. It's just nice to have that little bit of, like, levity in the middle of the season.
Honestly, Sound of Her Wings, this is just such a beautiful episode. I totally get why you like this one. I don't know if it's my favorite, but I think it probably is. And it's just so rich, and there's so much going on, and it's just done so pleasingly. I don't know. There's, like, I can't think of the word. It just sits nicely, you know, somehow, you know, and it's really odd, because, I mean, you spend so much time with Dream's sister Death, and, you know, especially coming off of the last episode, right? And then here you are with Death, and it could be horrifying as well, right? But it's not. It's actually beautiful, right? And and you know, just to try and, you know, think about this episode, I mean, one could do a whole podcast just on this episode, and indeed people have done that. I checked, and not surprisingly, because I you know, sometimes I like to look on the internet just to remind myself of different features of the episode, just in case I forgot something. And this one, I was really tempted to do that because there's so much there. So there are lots of people just spent a whole podcast just on this episode. So, what are we doing here? Well, we're trying to give our highlights of the things that we really enjoyed, right? So, yeah, I'm totally on the same page with you, right? This whole thing about with death and how death is depicted, kind and understanding. And, very often in other types of programs where you see death, death is usually cruel and jaded, and, it's just not like that. And it's just such an interesting way to view death, right? And it's a counterpoint to Dream's anger, right? And it really, I don't know, it just really points out in a way how Dream has sort of lost his way, and his sister is just helping him get back and sort of realize his importance, and somehow it's really strange because I feel like he's I don't know how old Dream is, but basically has been living forever, and he just doesn't seem to see have himself together like his sister does, right? So and then, what she said about, how she reflected on her role, and she did have trouble too. So I guess Dream is late to, trying to figure out what's his point, right? I guess. And she's already done it, and then she realized that really what people needed was a kind and friendly face, but still, like, and she talks about how she was worried about him, but I'm always wondering, if she was so worried and, wondering what, if he was okay, why did she not help him escape? I think she knew he was captured, right? And I think she also knew that the reason he was captured is because they meant to get her. Right. But somehow she doesn't help him. And I that is the one thing that I don't quite understand, but I'll just leave it. it's it doesn't distract me from the beauty of the episode, but it's just like, why didn't she give him a hand? But anyways, so there was that. But I think really what's happening here is that there's this huge character growth for Dream in this episode, and on so many levels. Right. So, so Death sort of sees herself, helping people when they're alone, or when they're most, when they're, I guess, because, that's when they're most vulnerable. Right. And I think she's sort of doing that for Dream in a way too. Right. So, so she's trying to help him. And then if you go back to Hob, right. And of course I love Hob, but I think even the fact that she made that experiment possible for him, right? Because in a way it was a social experiment, right? Just, eventually he's going to want to die, right? And so she made that possible. And I think that she, even then she was trying to help him, right? She has, he has to get out of the dreaming and get to know people. And that seemed to work well for her. And I think already back then she was trying to help him in this way. So this has been a process that has been going on for centuries. So I guess in a way then it isn't just, relatively recently, but he's been living for a long time, but she's been trying to help him for a while. So again, why she didn't help him escape his prison, I don't know, but she's definitely been trying to help him grow and see his role and sort of develop some sort of a healthy kind of relationship with someone, I guess. I don't know, but so Dream, and she recognized Dream needed someone, and it's someone who is not one of the endless, right? So someone he could confide in and sort of bringing himself out of himself, right? So he can sort of see things from another perspective, because she does say how self-centered he is, right? So the whole thing was just really interesting. And then if you think about Hob, right? And I think I was in the back of my mind, I was thinking, what would I do? Would I want to do this? Right. And, and I mean, I really think that's kind of interesting. The whole concept, would I give up? Clearly Hob doesn't. I don't know. I mean, it's not really worth thinking about it because it's not going to happen, but it's kind of makes you wonder while you're watching him and seeing the things that he's lost. And still he wants to keep going. And that sort of comes back to this whole idea of hope. And I think that's a lot of what Dream has learned from Hob in a way, right? And I think that's a theme that comes back over and over again with him. So that was the other thing. And then, and then just watching, and then the other thing is like to reflect on, and something that you've never seen before in any other kind of program where Death is a character. And it's just like, what is it like for Death to do that job? And so you're kind of like thinking about it, and it's like, and this is the first time I've ever seen something like that. So that's the other reason this was so intriguing. So, and then coming to that point, and you were saying that she seems to be very at peace with her role. And I again, like I said, I tried to look on the internet to make sure I'm not missing anything. I saw that there's a deleted scene, and it comes in right before Dream says something like, why do they so fear the sunless lands and they don't embrace this gift? And apparently there's a scene that was cut before then, and I watched it, and it wasn't in this episode, so it was obviously a cut scene. And she actually said that in this deleted scene that, once she went to take a girl, and the girl looked at her and said, how would you feel if this was you? And I thought that was an interesting thing. And then she goes on to say that, so what she does every 100 years is that she reminds herself what it's like to be greeted by herself. So essentially she, lived, I mean, she's living, but so this is the part that's kind of weird, but basically she tried it out, and she tries it out every 100 years. And at the end of the day, or at the end of, I guess, whatever period, she greets herself. And apparently the first time she did this, she wasn't happy to see herself, which was kind of an interesting thing. And that way she was able to relate more with humans and understand, how to guide them. And yeah, so she kind of wanted to know what it was like to do her own job from the other end. So it was just, another really intriguing thing. I wish they didn't delete that from the episode, because it comes back to the whole idea of 100 years. So why is it that they meet, Dream meets Hob every 100 years? Well, every 100 years she reminds herself what it's like to die. And it's really kind of, interesting, this theme of 100 years. And then the other thing that I saw, while I was looking at stuff on the internet, and you'd know this better than me, is how well this episode corresponds to the comics. And I was able to see little bits and pieces of the comics because I've not read them. And it's really interesting to see how much this episode is like the comics. So it's just another really cool thing about this episode. So yeah, that's a lot of what I'm thinking. I'm just trying to think, there's just so much to think about. The thing that was the one thing, because the episode is called "The Sound of Her Wings," and yet you never see them. I mean, I guess that's why you hear them as the sound of her wings. But I really would love to see what she looks like with those wings. So that was the other thing that I was thinking about, and I don't know if they show it in the comics. Do they actually show it? I don't know. That I guess I'll have to go and look at your comics and see that. But yeah, there's just so much in this episode, and I just love it. Anyways, I think that's one of the reasons that this is such a favorite episode, is because it's satisfying that we see Dream's growth, and that we see ideas that, challenge the way we might look at something, or make us think about, what would I do if I was that person? And I think that this episode really has so much from in that, and it comes back to the idea that, I guess, in a way that, people are all the same. Doesn't matter the time or the place. People just, really are similar. And I think that's another thing that you get out of this episode. And it's actually so, again, it's just the whole thing is beautiful. And it just touches all the right, points to make it really satisfying. So yes. And as you said, we have this one episode before things start to go crazy again. So, we'll keep watching, and I guess that's going to be the end for this podcast, but yeah, in another podcast, we'll keep going. So I'm really enjoying doing this with you. And it's this episode, there's just so much there. Maybe we should go back and just do an episode or a podcast just on this episode and look at, all the whole timeline with Hob. I don't know, but, and then all the different scenarios with death. Like I said, you could do one or two podcasts just on this episode because it's just so rich. But yeah, so let's just keep going and back to the mayhem for the next episode. This concludes our discussion of episodes 4, 5, and 6 of The Sandman. If you haven't yet, check out our podcast on episodes 1, 2, and 3. We plan to continue our revisit of The Sandman in future podcasts as we get ready for watching Season 2. If you're listening on audio, try to check us out at our YouTube location at Birds on Powerlines Podcast to interact with us and see some of our video podcasts. We'd also love to know your thoughts on these or any of the episodes of The Sandman, or anything else that you think is related, because we'd love to interact with you, so please comment. And in the meantime, thank you for listening and being part of the Birds on Powerlines podcast.